At that moment, she raised her glass, looked straight into my eyes, and said, "You're the family mistake." Everyone around laughed, even my wife. I just smiled and quietly dialed my lawyer. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel, hit like, and leave a comment if you've ever been in a situation like this. It was supposed to be a warm, cozy, festive evening. In the large living room, decorated with colorful garlands and balloons, a long table stood covered with holiday dishes. The air smelled of roasted turkey, grapes, and fresh pastries, while outside the windows a light autumn rain was falling. The chandelier shone almost too brightly, giving the room a glittering atmosphere, as if it weren't a family dinner but a grand ball. Everyone laughed, raised their glasses, and shared stories. In that moment, I felt slightly out of place among them, but I was used to it, years of being the quiet son-in-law, tolerated but always with a thin layer of disdain. I sat next to my wife, Emily, and across from me was her sister Sarah, the birthday girl. And Sarah decided to make a speech. She stood up, tapped her glass with a fork, drawing everyone's attention. "Tonight, I want to thank my family, my friends, and of course my sister," she began, "for always being there. And also," her voice turned sharp, "for proving that even family mistakes can look decent enough." Every eye turned to me. Someone snickered, others smirked, and my own wife, my Emily, sat right next to me laughing with her sister. That sound cut into me like ice. I didn't say a word. I just took a sip of wine and kept a calm expression. But inside, something snapped shut, like the heavy door of a vault locking forever. I looked at them, this table, these people who thought of me as invisible, weak, unnecessary. Around me, the room buzzed with laughter, but in my ears it became hollow and distant. I didn't stand up, didn't argue, didn't shout. I leaned back in my chair, wore the mask of indifference, and waited for the evening to end. I refused to give them the show they wanted. I refused to let them taste my anger. Already, I understood. Sometimes the loudest cry is silence. When everyone was still talking and cutting cake, I quietly stepped into the hallway, slipped on my coat, and left with a dry, "Thanks for dinner." An hour later, I was sitting in my car on a dark street, leaning back in the seat and dialing my lawyer. There was no surprise in his voice when I said, "It's time. Start the process." He answered simply, "Understood." And in that moment, my smile carried no anger, no sadness, only cold resolve. The days after that dinner felt strange, like walking through a fog that I had been waiting years to step into. On the surface, everything was normal. Emily and I shared the same house, the same kitchen, the same polite exchanges in the morning before she left for work. But there was a silence between us that wasn't the silence of comfort. It was the silence of two people who knew something had cracked wide open. She didn't bring up the birthday party, didn't mention her sister's words, didn't even attempt a half-hearted apology. It was as if she assumed I would swallow it like I had swallowed 100 small humiliations before. She was wrong this time. At the office, I went through the motions, attending meetings, answering calls, smiling when I had to. My colleagues didn't know that during lunch breaks I was sitting in my car, phone pressed to my ear, speaking in a low voice with my lawyer, David. He was calm, precise, almost clinical in the way he laid out the steps. He reminded me that nothing good comes from rushing, that we had to follow procedure, make every move airtight. I listened, nodding to myself, eyes fixed on the steering wheel, feeling for the first time in years that I was taking back control of something I'd given away. In the evenings I came home and watched Emily go about her routines. She'd be laughing into her phone in the living room, usually with Sarah. Their bond was strong, always had been. I used to admire it. Now I saw it differently. Every laugh felt like a blade. Every glance toward me like a silent reminder that I was the outsider, tolerated but never embraced. And yet I remained calm. I didn't confront her, didn't raise my voice, didn't even let my expression betray what was happening beneath the surface. She thought my silence meant weakness. She thought my stillness was surrender. She had no idea it was the quiet before a storm. Nights were the hardest. I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, the glow of the digital clock painting numbers across the dark. I thought about the years I had given to this marriage, the compromises I had made, the respect I had shown her family even when it wasn't returned. And I thought about that one sentence, that one public declaration, designed to humiliate me. Words have weight heavier than any blow. Her laughter, their laughter, replayed in my head like an echo. But instead of crushing me, it fueled me. It hardened something inside me I didn't even know was there. David called me on a Wednesday evening. His voice was steady, matter of fact. "The documents are ready," he said. "We can move forward tomorrow. Are you sure you want to do this?" I looked across the room at Emily, who was curled up on the couch scrolling through her phone, smiling at something I wasn't part of. "Yes," I said. "I'm sure." I hung up and walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stood there in the dim light, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. That sound was oddly soothing, like the world was still, waiting for what came next. The next day, the process began. I didn't announce it, didn't warn anyone. There was no shouting match, no dramatic confrontation. Just paperwork, signatures, and the wheels of something much larger quietly turning in my favor. Emily carried on as if everything was the same. She kissed me on the cheek in the morning, cooked dinner in the evening, never noticing that my phone buzzed with messages not from friends but from attorneys. It was a strange dual life, one where on the surface I was the same husband, but beneath it all I was building an escape route stone by stone. A week later I found myself driving through the rain, the wipers slashing back and forth, the road stretching endlessly ahead. I thought about what Sarah had said again, how she had smiled as the words left her mouth, how Emily had laughed beside her. They had thought it was a joke, something light to toss across a crowded table. But it wasn't a joke to me. It was a declaration, and declarations demand responses. As I drove, the city lights blurred through the windshield, and I realized that for the first time in years I wasn't angry. I wasn't broken. I was focused. A calm settled over me, the kind of calm that only comes when a decision has been made and there's no turning back. I parked the car outside my lawyer's office, sat there for a moment, and then stepped out into the night. Inside, the building was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every step echo. David was waiting for me with a folder in his hand. He didn't need to say much. We both knew what this meant. I signed the papers, one after another, the pen scratching across the pages like the sound of chains breaking. When I finished, I slid the folder back across the desk, leaned back in the chair, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. Walking back to the car, the rain had stopped. The air was clean, sharp, almost electric. I looked up at the dark sky and felt something shift inside me. I wasn't the same man who had sat at that birthday table in silence. Something had changed, something irreversible. And as I gripped the steering wheel and started the engine, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Silence can be sharper than any weapon. The days that followed moved with an almost unnatural stillness, as though time itself had paused to watch what was unfolding. Emily remained oblivious. She still carried herself with that same casual confidence, floating from one conversation with her sister to another, organizing brunches, sending texts filled with laughter and emojis, completely unaware that the ground beneath her feet was already beginning to shift. I played my part well. I was present, polite, predictable. To her, I was still the quiet husband who avoided conflict and let things slide. To everyone else, I was still that background figure, the one people looked past when they entered a room. But inside me, the silence had turned into steel. Every morning I woke earlier than usual, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, scrolling through documents, reviewing details, answering brief, concise emails from David. He was meticulous, a man who believed in patience as much as precision. He reminded me again and again that nothing good comes from letting emotions steer the ship. Facts, timing, leverage, those were the tools we used, and I began to appreciate the art of waiting. Emily noticed I was quieter than usual, though she didn't ask why. She assumed it was just my nature, the same nature she had long since stopped respecting. If she noticed me leaving the house more often, she didn't question it. If she saw me checking my phone at odd hours, she didn't pry. That was the thing about years of underestimating someone. You stop paying attention to them entirely. And in that blindness, I found my freedom. It wasn't long before the first ripple spread through her family. At a Sunday dinner, Sarah mentioned something offhand about an investment fund the family had always leaned on, a trust set up decades earlier by Emily's grandfather. She expected it to be a joke, a reminder of how her future was secure no matter what choices she made. But this time the joke fell flat. Her father shifted in his seat, her mother cleared her throat, and Sarah looked around the table, confused by their silence. I sat there quietly, eating my food, eyes lowered, letting the tension fill the room without needing to add a single word. That silence said enough. It was a silence I had been sharpening like a blade. After dinner, Emily confronted me for the first time in weeks. Her tone was sharper, a little less sure. "What's going on?" she asked. "My family's acting strange." Dad wouldn't even look Sarah in the eye. I shrugged. "Maybe they've realized something they should have a long time ago." Her eyes narrowed, searching my face for clues, but I gave her nothing. That was my power now, nothing. A blank wall she couldn't climb, a locked door she couldn't open. She walked away frustrated, muttering under her breath, and for the first time I felt no urge to explain myself, no urge to calm her down. I let her stew in her confusion. By midweek, the storm clouds truly began to gather. Sarah called Emily in a panic. I overheard bits of the conversation as Emily paced the living room. Words like access, blocked, documents, floated through the air. Her voice rose with each sentence, her usual confident tone crumbling into something closer to desperation. I sat in the next room, flipping idly through a magazine, as though her sister's panic meant nothing to me. But inside I felt a quiet satisfaction, not joy, not gloating, just the solid weight of balance finally tipping back in my favor. That night, Emily tried again. "Do you know something about this?" she asked, her voice softer, edged with unease. I looked at her, really looked at her, the woman I had once loved so fiercely, the woman I had given so many years to. "You laughed," I said simply. "You sat there and laughed." She froze, stunned by the calmness of my words, as though she had expected anger or accusations. But there was none, only the echo of her own actions reflected back at her. She turned away, unable to respond, and for the first time I saw a crack in her certainty. The following days were filled with restless energy. Sarah was calling constantly now, her once bright, mocking tone replaced with shrill urgency. Emily spent hours on the phone with her parents, her voice rising and falling in arguments I pretended not to hear. I moved through the house like a ghost, present but untouchable. I cooked meals, read books, took walks, all the while letting the storm rage around me without stepping into it. That was the secret. They had built their lives on the assumption that I would never act, that I would never have the courage to shift the balance. And now that it was shifting, they had no idea how to stop it. One evening, as Emily sat at the dining table with her laptop open, papers scattered across the surface, she slammed her hand down in frustration. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered. "None of this makes sense." I looked up from my chair, my expression calm, almost curious. "Maybe it makes perfect sense," I replied. She looked at me then, really looked, and I saw fear flicker in her eyes for the first time. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was there. And that flicker told me everything I needed to know. The silence between us grew heavier after that. She stopped laughing so much with her sister, stopped making those late-night calls that used to fill the house with noise. Instead, she lingered in rooms, watching me when she thought I didn't notice, searching for answers I had no intention of giving her. The power had shifted, and she felt it in every quiet pause, in every unanswered question, in every calm look I gave her. What once had been a marriage built on my compromise was now a stage where she struggled to understand the new script, a play where she was no longer in control of the lines. And through it all, I remained steady. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to explain. Every step forward was already written, already moving, and I simply walked the path I had chosen. The man they thought was weak, the man they laughed at, had finally learned the value of silence, and the weight it carried when the time was right. The final unraveling did not come with an explosion but with the quiet collapse of everything they thought untouchable. It began on a Thursday afternoon when Emily received a call from her father. I was sitting in the living room reading when she answered. Her voice was bright at first, hopeful even, but within minutes it cracked, and then it broke. She kept repeating, "No, that can't be right." Her hand pressed against her forehead as if the pressure of her own palm could change the truth she was hearing. I didn't ask what the call was about. I didn't have to. I already knew. That evening she sat across from me at the dinner table, her eyes red, her fork untouched on the plate. For the first time in years, she couldn't meet my gaze. She pushed the food around absent-mindedly and then whispered, "It's all gone. Sarah has nothing." Her voice trembled, the way it had never trembled before. I took a sip of water, set the glass down, and said nothing. Silence filled the room again, but this time it was hers, not mine. The next few days were chaos, at least for them. Sarah showed up at our door unannounced, her face pale, her words spilling out in frantic bursts. She accused, she demanded, she begged. Emily tried to calm her, but she was unraveling too. I sat quietly on the couch, watching them spin in circles, my presence barely acknowledged. For years I had been invisible to them, and now, in the middle of their panic, I was invisible again. But this time it was by choice, and in that invisibility lay the sharpest truth of all. They had underestimated the man who was sitting right in front of them. One night, long after Sarah had stormed out, Emily turned to me in the dark. She didn't bother with accusations. She didn't even try to deny what she already suspected. Instead, she whispered, "Why didn't you say anything?" I stared at the ceiling, the faint glow of the clock casting numbers across the shadows. "Because words are wasted on people who laugh at them," I said. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. She rolled away from me, pulling the blanket tight around her, but I knew sleep wouldn't come easily for her that night. Soon the calls from her parents grew fewer, colder. Emily spent hours pacing the house, her voice sharp and brittle when she spoke on the phone. She begged them to explain, to tell her what had happened, to find a way to fix it. But the truth was simple. The trust was no longer in her sister's hands. The future she had always believed was secured by family money had been rewritten, and no amount of pleading could change that. I didn't gloat. I didn't remind her of that night at the birthday table. I didn't need to. The memory of her laughter was punishment enough, and it played in her head louder than I ever could. One evening she broke. She sat across from me, her hair unkempt, her eyes hollow. "I thought you loved me," she said. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time I felt nothing. Not anger, not sorrow, not even regret. Just nothing. "I did," I replied, "until the moment you decided I wasn't worth standing beside." She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came. She shut it again, her lips trembling, and lowered her gaze. That was the moment she finally understood the depth of what had been lost. Not money, not inheritance, but the quiet loyalty of the man she had dismissed too many times. In the weeks that followed, I began to reclaim parts of my life I had abandoned long ago. I spent time with old friends, picked up books I had left unread, went for long drives with no destination. Emily remained in the house, moving like a shadow, her voice softer, her laughter gone. The phone calls from her sister dwindled into silence. The family gatherings no longer included invitations for her, and if they did, she never told me. Our home felt like a stage after the curtain had fallen. The audience gone, the lights dimmed, only the echo of what had once been. One afternoon, as I sat by the window watching the last leaves of autumn scatter in the wind, Emily approached me. Her voice was quiet, almost childlike. "Is this really it?" she asked. I turned to her, my expression calm, steady. "It was at the moment you laughed," I said. She nodded slowly, as though she finally accepted what had been true all along. She walked away, and I watched her go without a word. That was the difference now. I didn't need words. Silence had carried me further than any argument ever could. And so it ended not with shouting, not with broken dishes or slammed doors, but with quiet acceptance. She had her silence now, the same silence I had carried for years, but for her it was suffocating. For me it was freedom. As I stood one evening by the door, keys in hand, I looked back at the life I was leaving behind and realized that sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't fire or fury. It's walking away whole when the other person is left empty. And in that moment, she understood, and I understood. Silence sometimes speaks louder than any scream. If you stayed with me through this story, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Your voice matters here.